Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, the founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm, focused on contributing to solving Africa's most complex development challenges. And one of such challenges is poverty. Africa won't catch up with the rest of the world or even close the gap until it transforms the fortunes of rural Africa. Nearly 60% of our brothers and sisters reside in rural communities. 80% of Africa's poor can be found in these communities. Despite the vast natural and also human resources in these communities, they remain poor. Productivity is very low, weak infrastructure, poor connectivity to markets. Life there feels disconnected from the modern world. Too often, policy debates or discussions like this one stop at how to revitalize agriculture, as if agriculture is the only route out for these rural dwellers. Or the conversation could be around how to help smallholder farmers, do better. But rural Africa is much bigger than agriculture. It's time for us to begin to think at scale and also to build at scale. My guest today has dedicated most of his career thinking about these issues. Wandile Sihlobo is the chief economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, AgBiz. He serves as a senior lecturer extraordinary at Stellenbosch University's Department of Agricultural Economics and a visiting research fellow at the Wits School of Governance. Since 2018, Wandile has been a commissioner at the International Trade Administration Commission of South Africa. He's a prolific writer. He's a columnist for Business Day and Farmers Weekly, and author of multiple books on agricultural economics and land reforms. His thought leadership has made him an influential voice in shaping Africa's agrarian policy and rural economic development. Wandile, welcome.
That's very kind, Patrick, and thank you so very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to sit in one of these conversations at Nextier. And grateful to all of the people also that are joining us online for this conversation. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. And maybe I'll start by providing a little bit of a caveat to my first question. You may not know this, but my bachelor's degree was in agriculture as well. So my question is really, beyond food security, right? Why should we continue to discuss agriculture as a means of revitalizing rural Africa's economy, especially in the face of the emerging fourth industrial revolution, where it appears that we need different types of skill sets, assets to play in that world?
I think, Pat, this one is of course an important question, and I mean, today in South Africa, in our business daily, the Business Day, there's a column by a writer, in fact, the editor of the Conversation, the academic a newspaper that's available online. The Africa editor is a gentleman called Jabu Skakane. He has a piece in the paper today where he says, look, we need to move beyond agriculture and thinking about rural development in South Africa and begin thinking about it. And then he makes his case for South Africa. And he prompted me to respond, which I hope the newspaper put the letter out sometime this afternoon or tomorrow. But the point I'll make is this to what you're saying, Pat. I think agriculture must remain part and parcel of the conversation of how to transform the rural economies in Africa. But we do need, though, to reframe how we are thinking about agriculture. For many years, we have thought of it in this idea of a social aspect of saying just produce so that you can be food secure. And we obsess a lot about smallholder farmers and having a little thinking instead of saying, okay, this is an economic sector that is important. And in many countries in the African continent, it usually accounts for double digit as a share of their economies. If then we can come up with the fundamental way of increasing the agricultural productivity in the African continent, prioritize commercialization, and we begin to see this sector changing structurally, then I think we can see much more bigger gains than what we've been trapped on for many decades. And I think the value addition to where then the technologies you are referring to in the world of 4IR and all of these efficiencies that we can get from various technological applications, they then begin to be very powerful in that transformative way. So my answer, Pat, would be that we need to reframe on how we're thinking about agriculture, but still keep it there. But it won't be, of course, the end of it all, because agritourism is one of the aspects that you begin to thinking about it, agriculture and tourism, merging them. In South Africa, we have an area in the southwestern regions of South Africa, which we called the wine route, where then you visit and you taste all of these wines, but also the hospitality industry benefits on that. So we could have this in Nigeria, we could have this in Malawi, we could have this in Ghana. So depending on the cuisines of an area by area and what we do on that. And of course, there are other sectors then, Pat, that you could link, mining and the others. But I would still say this is an easy entry one, framed differently than what we've been doing.
So what is it that we as policymakers, tend to miss or misunderstand in terms of the potential that agriculture holds for rural development? What is it that we need to think differently about to help elevate, agriculture as that key engine that could drive rural development whilst every other thing comes along?
You know, Patrick, about 2 or 3 years ago, David Pilling, the Africa editor at the Financial Times, had a thought-provoking column that he put out where he was saying small is not always beautiful in terms of development. That was the title of his column. And the key point that he was raising was that, and it goes at the heart of the point that you are raising, what is it that we need to do? We've gotten used to the position whereby many leaders in communities, leaders in local government and in the national government in the continent, and even NGOs have gotten used to this point of saying, we are here to help. Africa has 80% of the farmers are smallholder farmers. Therefore, we're there to help them and make sure that they can produce for their communities. And I think now we have to say there is an asset base that is there. We are here to think about how do we optimize it? And I would start to say perhaps a concept that was introduced much more strongly in South Africa by our former president, Thabo Mbeki, who said, in a different context, better few, but better. Well, then we can say, how do we go region by region in many countries, selecting the better farmers that can actually be large scale anchors, then the medium and the small scale farmers can plug in into those. It can't be that we can be a continent that is focused just on subsistence farming, while we say there are all of these resources and we can produce so much for the world. And we know that the demand is there in the world. And if we can produce efficiently and of higher quality products, and we have the value chain infrastructure to link and deliver things to the markets in a most optimal time, then the game could pretty much change. Then that means then from a government perspective, and unfortunately this is a long-term thing, it's always a problem because people suffer from the challenge of horizon, of looking only from 3 years from where they are sitting. But it will take a long-term view of saying, all right, I am going to spend the next 4 or 5 years investing in building these roads so that farmers can move their things efficiently. I am going to spend the next 5 years thinking about how to improve land governance. The technology that is out there, I will use it now to map and allocate land and understand the land dynamics and capability in my country, then begin allocating it to farmers and bringing in agribusinesses. That also comes with a challenge whereby if you're a government or a community leader, it means easing up and letting power go so that people can have power for themselves, to empower themselves and their households. And I think that's that mindset dynamic whereby a government must not be a big daddy for village of always bringing in inputs, but we should think that entrepreneurial stuff. And I think young Africans, we are that mindset is pretty much there. I just hope that when they are getting into positions of leadership, they don't start thinking, oh, power is very nice now, let me keep things in order and remain in charge, but they liberate the continent.
Wandile, you opened too many vistas here, and I'm trying to see if we can, just chase them down, more specific details. And let me go back to the Thabo Mbeki idea, which is choose a few, and if I understand you correctly, choose a few winners, run your winners, and those winners are going to pull everyone behind them, right? This has been a big policy debate amongst economic policy folks. When we think about places like South Korea, that and the Shabos that picked some winners and helped them become big players, and by so doing, grow the economy, grow all the other players in the space. In Nigeria, for instance, we have some of that, issues in, say, the oil and gas sector, where prior governments picked some winners, and the hope is that they can solve problems that the government could not solve. If we look at agriculture specifically, if I'm hearing you correctly, it is to say that there are some players who may need some level of government support to become more successful. And by so doing, they would support the smaller holders and other medium-sized players. Some scholars might argue that, that is kind of picking winners, and it's not an efficient way of doing it, that we should allow market efficiency to drive who wins and who loses. Have you spent time thinking about this, and what is your view on these points?
I mean, I think that both viewpoints they stand on this quite solidly, because I wouldn't dismiss and say they are wrong on that. And let's be fair, all of this also differs sectorially, regionally, and market conditions also differ. And when we are saying picking winners, we are not necessarily saying decide who and what sector. Let's take this context and we say what to do with Africa's agriculture.
Yes.
And if you coming as an example to a country like South Africa, it has about 9 provinces. You decide that in South Africa's 9 provinces, I will support about 10 large scale black farmers in each province, because the challenge I'm having in South Africa is not the challenge of growth in agriculture. I'm having racial disparities in agriculture. Therefore, to close the racial disparities, I'll take 10 black farmers and try to support them to be commercial in all provinces of this country. How you select that, you will go for the farmers that the market has already sifted and put them upwards. And I understand that that is an unfair system, because now you will be taking public funds and then selecting a few. But that's a policy choice that you have to make. But I do think that there is an appetite for a significant pool of African farmers that are operating at a world level with a scale, both for aspiration for the future, but also on building these infrastructure that others over time they may plug in. It's not going to be a system of fairness, but I do think that in terms of boosting the output and in terms of over time creating the pathways for others to climb up, we may actually be able to do that. In agriculture, it may work. But if you were to take that and go to mining and go to oil industry, because of the tougher barriers to entry there, you may not actually see that. While in farming, one can argue that it's something that perhaps maybe can work, because there's also that power of aggregation that makes agriculture quite distinct with the other industries where such things may not always be applicable.
Interesting. Let me push one more question around the policy issue. Is the problem we're facing with rural development centered more around how we have over time defined these rural communities? And what I mean here is, if you go back to like from our independence, most policymakers, leaders have always looked upon rural Africa as a place that needs to be helped, and not as a wealth engine, not as a center of economic activity. And in fact, if you look at the policies that we've used in rural development, it's always been around, rural development strategy or community-based development strategy or integrated rural development. There hasn't been this link up with the commercial urban centers where we see the rural communities as economic engines. If you agree with my premise, why do you think this is so? Why do you think that policymakers are not able to see the assets, that exist in these rural communities?
I mean, I would venture here and say it is all, Patrick, really the policy choice that people have to make. And if you can bear with me, I'll make a point, and I know that many fellow Africans don't have time for this because there's always this idea that some people in South Africa push the idea of thinking that they have their own South African way of doing things. But bear with me on making this particular point, this one. So the African continent in its totality, net importer in food. We are bringing in as a continent about 80 billion US dollars of food products. You take away the Maghreb region, you leave all of us in sub-Saharan Africa region. We spend each year about 45 billion USD on imports into the sub-Saharan Africa region. One looking at the continent in that way can say this is a continent plunged in hunger and in need and all of those things. Therefore, go away and learn how to farm from America, Europe, Australia, and all of these places. But that picture is not uniform because if you can look into it, there are glimpses of light here in South Africa, for example. We sit at a position where we export about half of what we produce. We export about 14 billion US dollars of food products each year. And what makes the South African agricultural sector different from much of the African continent is probably about five broad things that I think, even if not adjusted to all countries in equal proportion, but they are worth debating as to should we explore those. What are those things? The first thing, Pat, is that in South Africa, there's been a deep embrace of structured and prioritization of property rights, whereby land is nicely governed. Each farmer has their own allotted piece of land. They can trade it, they can do whatever they want to do. And you contrast that with much of the African continent, where you realize that over 90% of the rural land is actually informal. The land rights are not clear. Then what you do then there, you are minimizing and squeezing off the investments that could have flowed in from agribusinesses and many others. The second aspect, which is a policy choice also, there's been a disconnect or distrust of embracing technology in terms of the seed cultivars, better seed cultivars, and all of those things, either because they are brought by multinational or whatever belief that many people would have. The difference, which is a case then in South Africa or in the continent, is the fact that there's been an embrace of that scientific aspect. Again, or large-scale farming has been embraced instead of the smallholder farming is a third aspect that has actually differentiated. And of course, there are inherent privileges that have been there, the infrastructure, the connectivity that has already been in. But the point I'm getting at is that these are some of the fundamental learnings where we can say, okay, should we be following this path? Should we be exploring all of these? Which is what I think for much of the African continent. Those are things that we must do. And of course, other stuff that I didn't mention, like limiting the intervention into the markets by the governments, like what Zimbabwean government is doing at the moment, at any point deciding that you will stop the imports or you will stop the exports of particular products while disrupting the business activity of many of these businesses for the short-term benefit of either you wanting to control food inflation or any other aspect on that. So these are all choices that I think as the continent we have to actually play around with rather than romanticizing the idea of smallholder farmers. And this is not to say don't pay attention to smallholder farmers. They play an important role for regional food security. But I think there has to be a change in how we are thinking about development in rural areas, especially in the area of agriculture.
Your last two books kind of focused a lot on property rights and its role in developing agriculture on the continent. Can you deepen that conversation a little bit and use it to explain how it drives productivity, which is a big issue for agriculture and rural development, and also maybe even access to market. How does solving the property rights issue kind of unlock all the other tangles that we have holding us back?
I mean, Pat, while I make the story of South Africa, I mean, it is not uniform. South Africa remains a country of two agricultures.
Mm-hmm.
You have the large scale, mainly white farmers that are in the commercial space, and you have a vast number of black farmers that are sitting in the smallholder farmers. And the distinct thing, amongst other things that have to do with the historical context, is around this land aspect. Because where majority of the black farmers are sitting in South Africa is in the areas that were reserved. We call them former homelands. In the before the dawn of democracy, those are the areas that they were in. And what has been a failure of the South African government on that is that it has been very reluctant of saying, how does it improve the land governance in the former homelands? While the very same test case is here in the same country, where you have this aside of agriculture, which has a property rights, and he has a lot of capital that is flowing in and doing all of these big things. I mean, the commercial banks in South Africa, which are all over, take Standard Bank, for example, which is all over the African continent. These banks have put in the South African farming sector about 220 billion rands as a farm debt that they've said, this is the money, you are utilizing it to do all kinds of things. This is how then the commercial farmers are able to deliver and produce all kinds of these things. But that part of agriculture, which is sitting with informal land, if you look at the flow of capital to that, they are pretty much starved of that capital because of the inherent risk that is both on the weak land governance, as well as then the inability to obtain the technology and all of these productivity issues that ends up piling in that area, which is why you sit with this disconnect. So as much as I'm saying South Africa is a case we can explore as a continent, but South Africa is a case that the South African politicians can look at within here and say, how do we correct the other parts?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it
Mm-hmm.
shows then the lack as well as a possibility of what we could achieve.
Interesting. And maybe just one more question on this. You mentioned in your last submission, our hesitance to adopting technology or even scientific basis to agricultural development. One question that comes to mind is the ongoing debate across the continent on the place of GMOs, GMO foods, crops, in our agricultural practice. Where are you on that argument? Is it something that we should be focusing on? Is it something that would kill off our agriculture and probably eat our people, which is a narrative that is being pushed out there? What are your views?
I mean, Bet, about 2 months ago, I went out in a conversation with the Financial Times, focusing particularly on that aspect to say we should stop playing a small game here and be open to that technology. And I was drawing that case again, looking at South Africa, which opened its doors to genetically modified crops in 1999 2000 production season. If you take, for example, a staple grain in Southern Africa is maize, corn, and the yields in South Africa on dry land, non-irrigated maize, they are about 6 tons per hectare on average. When it's irrigated, it's double digit. You cross the border of South Africa and you look all the way up north. The yield is about 0.5 tons per hectare. I mean, we shouldn't be having that. And let's remember, South Africa is a fairly semi-dry, arid country. Only about 15% of South Africa you can actually farm productively in terms of food crops. The majority of it is dry and it's utilized for livestock and all kinds of things, while the country is as big as 122 million hectares. That means then there are yield benefits that we can get from the technological aspect. But I do sympathize with part of the point that many Africans make, which is that I hear our friends in Zimbabwe, for example, and many other countries, we say, look, we cannot bring in all of these technology because we have a vast number of smallholder farmers that in the next season won't have enough money to go and buy these seeds. And that's the real issue. And then I think for me, we should, as Africans, look then into this and say, we are not going to look into this as a challenge, but rather we will say, how do we engage with the seed developers so that we are not putting the farmers at risk when they can't procure this? But also as governments, what program can we put in place to ensure that they are cushioned rather than being resistant on this? And this is, by the way, one of the things, Patrick, that almost happened in Kenya. Because when William Ruto, the president of Kenya, came into power, this is one of the things that he ran and he talked about. And I was hoping that he would actually get it over the line, but he ended up failing. And I must say here, and many people may not like the point I will say, but I do think that the NGOs, also some funded by EU and the others, they've really pushed some of the counterproductive narratives about the genetically modified crops. Because the painful point for me is that if you take Zambia and you take South Africa out of the equation and you look at the sub-Saharan Africa region, there's work done by Tom James at Michigan State University and his colleagues where they show that the yield gain in much of these of the countries in the continent has actually been because of the expansion in area planting of grain rather than the improvements in the yield, which means then now we are cutting more trees to plant instead of getting more on a little land. So if you're an NGO concerned about climate change and environmental aspect, you should be saying what technology can be used to get more out of limited area so that we conserve the biodiversity, and not to abuse technology, but to optimize it to improve yields for soil correction and also utilize any of the. So that's where I sit on this. And I think as Africans all across, we should be saying, how do we utilize the technological capabilities that are there within the bounds and thinking of our domestic policies rather than blocking the doors?
And I know that you mentioned a few other points like the large-scale farming and linking to international markets, etc. But I wanted to, come down to something a bit more practical. So when we often talk about challenges in Africa, we talk about the last mile problem, getting goods and services to local communities, but increasingly I'm thinking that maybe what the challenge we have in Africa is actually a first mile problem, where it is how do we get goods from the farms to the markets? It may not be a particular challenge in South Africa, but it's a bigger challenge in the broader sub-Saharan African continent because we don't have the infrastructure to get our goods to market. And sometimes in countries like Nigeria, post-harvest losses could be even as much as 50%. In your thinking about these issues and in travels around the continent, have you found any effective ways, pragmatic ways that farmers are beginning to address this first mile challenge?
I mean, Pat, I would still, I agree fully with you. And by the way, starting again on a bigger point here before I get to the practicalities, this is one of the things that worries me a lot, even when I think about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And my worry is that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will end up having few people sitting in the table eating, while others are struggling, which means then those countries that have the infrastructure capability and the yield gains will be able to move their product and actually dominate the trade, while others that have been sitting on the periphery of this progress will remain there and be drowned out by the others. And I think it has to come to what investments can we make on easing up the infrastructure. And unfortunately, the infrastructure investments aspect is other choices that African governments must decide on doing that, because while farmers may utilize some form of technologies on conserving their products and ultimately to link up and to think about regional value chains that all of us write and talk about. That requires the practical things of saying, is there a road that links there? Is there a railway line that links there? And these are the choices that I think we need to talk about. And also then the developmental finance institutions that are there. I do think that they have to nudge the governments and the treasuries as they interact with them to say perhaps we will avail much more funding pool for infrastructure that could be ABC and build all of these corridors that could be vital for trade. Otherwise, you will end up with the countries in the north and then some in the east, and some in the west Nigeria, and the others in the south South Africa, dominating all of these things that we are talking about, and other countries in the continent just sitting on the side. And then you will actually have a political economy risk, because now you have taken away even the tariff revenues that these governments used to take before we had all of these African continental free trade agreements, while they are unable to produce and move their goods. So I think these, yes, they are not as granular for the farmers to do anything, but I do think that some of the colleagues that follow the work of Nextier, they do need to take this into their respective government level, regardless of which country that you are in, and say perhaps the continental infrastructure conversation needs to be elevated. Otherwise, we will be choked in the coming years if we don't resolve that.
Exactly, exactly. And, again, Wandile, in my intro, I said these discussions about fixing rural Africa somehow tends to move deeply into agriculture, as if it's the only route for these regions. It's not the only, it's important, but not the only. So I'd like us to kind of broaden our conversation beyond agriculture to say, what are some of these other economic activities in these regions, in these communities, that we should be thinking about? What are they? And how do we begin to explore how to, how to build up on them, to make them credible economic sources for revitalizing or re-energizing rural Africa?
I think, though, Pat, all of this hinges on your last point, the infrastructure aspect. Because if we are going to talk about tourism, that means the network of connecting efficiently and easily or stress-free from one city to another, from one region to another, and for the villages to showcase the culture, the food, and all of these things that can actually be presented to tourists. That is the one aspect that needs to be improved, alongside the aspect of security across the continent, which also needs elevated on this, because those are the supportive mechanism for tourism and other exploration that can happen. And there are businesses then that can spring out from the second layer, even if then the community is focused on mining, on agriculture, doing something on tourism. They spring up as an addition on that. But I think fundamentally infrastructure has to be there. And I would say the network industries are the primary aspects. So roads, water, and the energy will still be one of the key things that I would say they are the fundamentals for any then of the industries that we can think about. And I think it's always tempting to say, no, 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 there's technology now, we can create all of these things, but we forget that much of what we say we can create online, it's either providing services and all of those things, but the good old work that requires to be done for infrastructure is still needed. Otherwise, those gains will always be obscured to the countries in the West or in the East that already are far ahead of us in Africa in that infrastructure aspect than where we are sitting, which is why for me, I sympathize, and I think that infrastructure conversation is something that needs to be lifted up, because they need to unlock all of these other industries that are in addition to agriculture, on how we developing particularly from a rural and also broadening beyond food and agriculture. And I do think that, Pat, even in agriculture, we have to change the conversation. Perhaps it needs to be added where we can say agriculture as well as food, fiber, and the beverages industry. So that, because I mean, fashion is agriculture, clothing, all of this stuff comes from agriculture. There's a whole host of things that can happen, but also then the value addition that happens beyond that in beverages and the others. These are all things. And in fact, those are also the areas where high quality jobs or high paying jobs would come from, instead of only on the farm level side, because everyone has aspirations of getting a better pay so that they improve the standards of living of where they are.
Mm. And so this infrastructure, I mean, any way you cut it, it comes down to it's a responsibility of the government. It's the government that's got to put in many of these massive infrastructure. And that begins to veer towards a political conversation here as to how do we get the government to focus on rural communities when these politicians are faced with this very short time frame of you've got elections coming every 4 years, and they're focused on getting the people in the big cities to like them and vote for them? How do we show, and I struggle with this, but how do we get government to really focus on the rural communities, knowing that that's where the growth engine, as I see it, resides, and that we need to work that engine for the productivity we need to even drive economic activities in the urban centers. I don't know if that makes sense, and if you've
No,
if you've given some thought to it.
I mean, yeah, you're making sense there, but because then what it ends up on, it's on the choices that people have to make, the horizons at which they look at things. But I would also still say organizations like Nextier and many others that are either think tank or forums of discussion that are able to have a convening power of leaders to actually sit and listen to what discussion. And some of the things that needs to be elevated, even on your research and the consultancy aspect, is of showing the medium and long-term gains. Because I think some of the governments, perhaps maybe they may not be paying attention to that because it's not mapped in a coherent way of saying this is what we could achieve, and thereafter build a narrative on that. Because I think people can still vote for the politicians if the narrative is clear, as well as the pathway at which people are going towards is pretty much clear, and they can see what this development that they are promised. Although the election cycle and the horizon is always short term, I think that assisting people in crystallizing that vision is something that has to be pretty much refined and done. Because in my mind, from where I'm sitting at, there is no escape on this. If a bridge is needed, a bridge is needed. I don't think it's
Simple.
responsible to say, I don't need a bridge. I will have a drone to take something here and drop it there. Therefore, you are moving with drones and you are not having any connected network system. I think some of these can be a short-term mechanism of closing issues, but the infrastructure that you go to London and enjoy, you go to Cape Town and enjoy, you go to Abuja and enjoy, you need that infrastructure everywhere. It ultimately has to be done.
So, okay, let me try this again. And I know that we've kind of touched on this particular question throughout the conversations, but let's see if you can help me crystallize the answers to it. Number one is, why are we still stuck in subsistence agriculture, despite the many decades that we've talked about the need to commercialize, the need to improve productivity, etc.? If you can just help listeners, some of them government folks, some of them think tanks, and so on, see why this continues. And then the flip side to that conversation is, are there some thoughts, some ideas that you've seen in your toing and fro in Africa on how to mobilize massive resources, capital, to invest in rural Africa, to get us to become more commercial, more productive, and just to, expand the economic activities in these regions?
I mean, I think the reason we are still stuck at a level that we are in, I mean, it's a political choice, and I won't blame only the politician here. The tribal council, the chiefs, the traditional leaders, they are amongst those that are in here, because they get to be custodians of some of this land that ultimately is owned still by the governments on this. And I think for me, that's the political choice at which we are not managing to move beyond and empower these communities. Had we been able to do that, I think we could be far. Over and over, literature does show that whereby you improve land governance, capital follows through. The practicalities of saying, is there anywhere where we can get this money? I mean, I'll give you an example. A number of countries, such as Saudi Arabia, they've gone out to say they want particular crops. They are interested in avocados or they are interested in grain. And they've gone into certain regions where they've actually assisted in putting the necessary infrastructure, the necessary grain elevators in, so that as long as they have a certain amount of time, years or lease, whereby that produce can actually be produced, and they would have a portion at which they are exporting to their regions. And such arrangements have been made in a number of communities where we have seen as a case studies, and that has brought about the change on what to do. So the appetite to buy products of scale and of quality is available out there. The appetite to invest is available out there. But as long as we quickly begin to clarify the rule of the games domestically, and then be able to make those choices that this is what we will do. Because very few African countries have actually gone out and say, right now, we are selecting this state, and in it, we are improving land governance. We are calling in investors from any other country to come in and assist us on doing that. None of them have actually gone out and done that and see what happens beyond that. And there are some of these case studies where there's money that flow in the sector. I made an example of the billions of South African rands that are being put into into this sector as a result of some of those things. And I think for me, amongst other things, that's something that we may need to try and let go of power of controlling some of these regions and let people to take charge of the communities that they are in.
Interesting. And just to say to our listeners, as always, we're going to open it up to your Q&A, but just type your questions in the Q&A tab, not the chat room, the Q&A tab, so it's easy for me to pick it up from there and then have Wandile, speak to them. Well, Wandile, let's talk again about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and its promise to integrate markets. Yet there are so many of these African countries that maintain restrictions on export. Some of those restrictions could be driven by internal political considerations on food security or to regulate food price inflation, etc. In your conversations in ITAC and your engagements at these, continental levels, how are you guys thinking about these issues? How are you thinking about streamlining just the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and ensuring, freer trade flows and ensuring closer regional trade integration?
I mean, Pat, nothing I wish more than the continent finally living up to its potential. Because, I mean, it's painful to always hearing this discussion that one day Africa will do 1, 2, 3. One day Africa will do 1, 2, 3. There's a Malabo declaration. There's Johannesburg declaration. Many of these declarations, but very little promise get to be made. Because I'll tell you what, fellow Africans are not going to eat declarations. They are going to they require meaningful improvements in their lives. And my challenge in here is a lack of coordination on what we are doing. Of course, one of the things that we need to do is harmonize the rules, especially in the agricultural products, so that things continue to move and move freely across the borders. But that is not going to happen if we are, again, not agreeing that science is what will take the African continent forward in food production. You either block genetically modified or you block new genetical improvements that are being made on being planted in your country, and then you use that as a non-tariff barrier, which is what we are seeing. And those are engagements that we are having with many others. But again, to your point, these tends to be a domestic consideration ultimately. We can discuss it at a continental level. I mean, I'm sitting in a country here in South Africa. I'm talking to you from Pretoria at the moment. And Namibia, which is neighboring South Africa, has actually blocked the vegetable imports from South Africa to going to Namibia. And there is no necessarily clear justification on that, except of saying, okay, we don't need them now. We want to boost our own domestical production. And mind you, these are countries that are in the customs union in SACU. And we know that people are breaching the rules by doing that. But then again, when you put yourself into a Namibian policymaker, everywhere you move, there are products from Durban, from Pretoria. It may feel suffocating. You want to see some of your products coming up, which then comes back to the idea of saying the regions in the continent, those in the west, those in the south, those in the east, can we begin to think about the regional value chains in a way whereby we harmonize the rules, but also harmonize the inputs at which the farmers can have capabilities on, so that there is, because what we ultimately want, Pat, is shared prosperity across, not to be suffocated by one another. But then
Exactly.
that shared prosperity requires that coordination at a political level, which is where then I think that that differences in aspiration and the strategy at a political level begins to be an issue. Because ultimately, as you know from your undergraduate work, we can talk about this, but agriculture is a scientific matter ultimately.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think there always have to be that idea that this is not a social development matter. This is a scientific matter which needs to guide us, guiding us, and also framed on an economic perspective, because all Africans need is an improvement in their living standards.
Hmm. 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 Excellent. And so I have a question here from Deirdre Lapine, who I believe is probably joining from Washington, D.C., but's done a lot of work across the continent and in Nigeria. I've worked with her in the past. And her question is, there's, different countries have had these different attempts at a green revolution um, since our independence. What, in your view, are some of the reasons why this big push, green revolution, the mantra, the policies, the programs around them never quite yielded the results, that they were set out to yield?
I mean, I think Deirdre will agree that much of this end up in big conferences. Either we are sitting in Nairobi talking about it or somewhere, but very seldomly some of these things end up at the ground level. I mean, I won't even lie to say even the South Africa case that we were making was largely on a government side. On a government side, it was an improvement in sense that there was limited intervention and they were not having a strong appetite to put restriction to technology. But everything else was largely done by the private sector on bringing some of those very limited forward attempt put by the government. And even if you can think, Deandra probably knows those Malabo declaration where each African country said they would spend X amount of their budget on improving research and all of the work done towards agriculture to achieve the gains that we're all talking about. But it never really yielded on that. In a way, I would still say to me, from my perspective, it leans back again of saying, are we embracing science or not? Are we having a common understanding of what could improve the yields and then move forward from there? But I think all of this is still hinges on the political consideration of those that are running countries in the continent.
Excellent. And I have a question from Folari Badebo Smith, who until recently was the Director General of Nigeria's think tank, the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research, and also has been a guest on this show. And his question is, will you, Wandile, elaborate a bit more on the tension between ownership of the food chain and GMO seeds. And he says it is clear that when the chips are down, and here he wants us to think about the COVID-19 vaccines, you had better be self-sufficient in essentials. The West cannot be trusted to supply critical needs, and this is a matter that can easily be weaponized. What is your view, especially with your strong support for GMO seeds and the ownership of the food chains, etc.?
I mean, I think the former TG is right that this and he's raising this issue at a difficult time at the moment, given all of the context of the policy direction that we are all observing on Truth Social from the White House. That it tends to have a bit of complications because certain things can be stopped. And I think the former teacher can think of this in the same way as at which the chips are now managed, where certain countries suddenly stop exporting to other countries the chips for their development in their technological direction because it can get weaponized. So my thinking on this is this. One, when you decide that you are going to open up for genetically modified crops, you as the government have to make sure that you have enough capital resources to put into your agricultural research council and then insist on the technology supplier that is bringing these yields to your country that they share some technology with your agricultural research council, but make it clear that your agricultural research council is only going to be doing seed improvement and the research, but is not going to release this technology for commercial use. so that if ever they are able to decide that they will pull out their technology from your country, you need to have the scientific capabilities to actually be able to produce this. And this is what in South Africa we have ours, which we call the Agricultural Research Council of South Africa, the ARC. The insistence was that it has to actually have the domestic scientists that can produce almost equal or even far surpasses what you have to release at a commercial use. Because if you don't do that, I mean, the DG's risk that he raises, I mean, is ultimately true. But the other thing that hedges against that risk is also that the ownership now of these companies is no longer concentrated to one country. You have others that are owned by China Chem, you have others that are owned by the US, you have others that are owned by the European aspects. But I think it's always just making sure that you have a breeding program in your domestic country that can actually match those capabilities when you decide to go down that route. But if you don't have any breeding program and you are depending everything on what is being supplied, there is some level of risk. I mean, there is that unknown possibilities. But still, with all of that being said, I would still say it far outweighs this benefit that we can get. And you just have to have that coordination in a clear way. Thanks.
Interesting. And another question from Olusegun Debiyi, and he said, you talked about seeing rural areas as economic engines and not places in need of help. One feasible way that he proposes is through the power of aggregation, so have the local farmers aggregate and then maybe an off-taker, picks it up from there. He said, has such a process been implemented in South Africa? If yes, how can we replicate this in other nations? So here I think he's thinking like lessons learned, etc.
No, I mean, he's right there, Pat, because there's a technology a developer in South Africa. It's young guys called Khula, Khula exclamation mark. They have an app, Khiula, Khula. What they do is they have, of course, the trading platform that is there where they showcase at whatever region what's available. Each farmer can quickly log in and list their product. And then they have a logistics capability where they can go and collect. And all of this is linked to a certain payment system. I think they partner with Absa Bank, which assists them onto that. So that aggregation model does work because the same organization is able then now over time to offer inputs to these farmers, distributing these inputs. The farmers can buy as a group, which lowers their transaction costs, and then they are able to have a much more affordable fertilizer than they would otherwise gone individually on that. And I would say such things needs to even go then beyond and be formalized so that you have these mini cooperatives that people can have, and then they can decide that in a certain region of Nigeria, we will only be focusing on soybean. In a certain region of Kenya, all we will do is just avocados so that we are able to have a volume at which we can put into market. It is being tried in South Africa, of course, not all over the country, but there are certain regions at which that is succeeding. And I understand that these guys, they are expanding across Southern Africa. So it's one of those things. And I think M-Pesa and the others in Kenya, they have certain platforms that are similar to that, where in Kenya these things happen. And I think the avocado industry in Kenya and even the floriculture one operate one way or another in a similar aspect as that, which is why I think even in South Africa, they can look at what smallholder farmers in Kenya are doing and say, can you do that in South Africa? Can you do it in Swaziland, in Lesotho? So it's things like that. But his point, he's on point on that.
Yeah, and it's difficult for many of these economic policy type conversations not to veer towards, some political conversations as well. So permit me this question from Tunde Arogunmati. He says, how can the rural communities develop sustainable capacity for engaging in the overarching political narrative, especially in cases of a nation like Nigeria, where the local government authority tends to be relegated to the background in national discourse? And I'm just tacking on the back of that to say, in your walk across the continent, have you seen, where in some of these local communities, they found ways of elevating their voices as a collective, in the national debates, especially on policies that affect their well-being, their commercial activities, etc.?
I think, I mean, what we have seen as being a success is making sure that the farmer organizations are something that are prioritized, whereby you must have commodity associations and the farmers can have this group. I mean, it's quite remarkable now that you're mentioning it in that way, because in South Africa, you have the farmer associations where when they have spoken, it becomes clear in Pretoria that they have spoken. So they gain that political power. But I think what then gets to be important on that, those farmer association, they need to be careful about how much of outside funding they receive, because if they happen to be perceived to be funded by the UK, EU, or American, or whatever the funding is coming from, they may be seen not as a legitimate power that does that. But I do think that fundamentally, one of the other things in our continent we need to think about as fellow Africans is that when we think about infrastructure, yes, heavy infrastructure is important, Pat, but soft infrastructure is something that is needed also, of saying, how do you form institutions? And I think this links to the point that you are raising now, of saying, do we have the soft institutions, which then needs the intellectual capability of bringing all of these things together? Because people in the villages and in various communities, I mean, they are hard pressed, preoccupied by their own survival of getting by. They're not sitting back and thinking about how do we reorganize the landscape that we are in. And I think this is where then the interventions have to be in two ways of doing this. And this is always a difficult thing in even here in South Africa, whereby if you think about the former homelands, these former reserves, you find that they don't actually have that much strong of a soft infrastructure of having these organized groupings that can then go out there and bargain for them and lift their messages at a national level, and that they can have a political sway on the allocation of resources to some of the fundamental things that are needed for them. Because ultimately, the politicians will attend to things that are elevated at a national level, will make them to be seen to be doing something. And if your matter is not that much notable, you may find that it doesn't get addressed. And this is why these things are important.
Another question from Ifeanyi Maduanosi, and he says, thanks so much for this productive engagement. But aside from the elevated conversations on the potential political and economic risks of the ACFTA to many of the countries and the economic risks to the farmers, what practical measures would you recommend to overcome many of these issues that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area seems to be having?
I mean, I think beyond that, it's a good agreement that we all having. The only thing that I would say is that for much of the speeches that I'm reading from leaders in our continent is that they tend to sell it as if it's gonna solve all of our problems tomorrow. But this is not all what we are have doing here. We are restructuring that there are now clear rules for us to move product from point A to point B with limited friction. But the good old problems that have been there, they still need to be resolved. I'm actually doing that. Beyond that, I would say I'm pretty much optimistic, but I'm optimistic about the AFCA for 10 years rather than what we get told that it will help us tomorrow. I don't
Yeah.
think that tomorrow we will be able to be helped by this. So
Interesting.
it's a buildings block towards something that may be meaningful.
No, fantastic. Thank you for that. Just shifting gears a little bit. Obviously, that there's been a significant decline in international aid to Africa. Some of this aid, yes, went to more the social type, also trickled to agriculture, but largely they should have trickled to rural Africa. With this decline, are you seeing any signs, especially from the southern parts of Africa, on how community-based organizations?
I mean, Pat, one of the big problems that we are, I mean, Pat, one of the problems that we are currently observing is, for example, test case Malawi. And Malawi is struggling at the moment because they didn't have a good harvest. But whenever they struggled with this, you'll see that the World Food Program would step in. But over time, of course, aid have gone to Ukraine, aid have gone to the Middle East, but also the Doge in the US have reduced some of the aid that would have otherwise been gone there, because we know that the US aid, they funded about half of the budget of the World Food Program, and this has created a bit of difficulty for them. As to whether then the African countries will be able to have a bit of resilience on this challenge is something that is yet to be seen. But I'm very worried about the current moment that the weaker World Food Program, because of the US policy decisions, as well as the shift of aid from other countries to Europe, to the Middle East, as deserving as those areas are. But there are many other problems in the continent, not only just environmental, but there's conflicts in part of Nigeria, conflicts in Sudan, conflict in Mozambique. All of these, they do need some bit of assistance. And to my mind, at least on having encountered the better ways of saying, how do we come out of this? What I will say, though, in terms of food, all of us in the continent, we are now weeks to the start of the 2025-26 production year. In South Africa, we are starting from the 15th, which is next week, to till the eastern regions of South Africa. Others will start a month, others in 2 months' time. I think that the local governments, they must do whatever they can to support the farmers on increasing their production, supplying fertilizers, whatever that is needed in here, because we will see the real effects of the shortage of that World Food Program and the other forms of aid in the months and the seasons to come. And that may put us in a very difficult area as the continent.
Fantastic. And again, moving more into solutions, thinking about solutions here. Another question from Folari Badebo Smith. Are there examples of countries, maybe even in Africa or outside Africa, that have successfully migrated from small to medium scale or even commercial farming? And if there are, what are some of the routes, models that they used in making this transition? And what are the lessons there for African countries that really need to make the same migration from smallholder farmers to commercial production?
I mean, I won't make an example from a country, but I could make an example from a regional perspective. What we have
Okay.
seen happening in certain regions of South Africa, provinces of Free State and the others, is that there are areas whereby the commercial farmers typically go to, and if the area is as better organized, decide that they will partner with the farmers in that community to either till the land or improve the genetics of their livestock. And whenever that has happened, we have seen them moving from being smallholder, getting in the commercial ladder, and others progressing and tapping into the export markets. I know that in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, there was a huge program to improve the genetics for wool farmers. And the sheep farmers, they introduced new rams and all of that, and they began getting high quality wool. Now we are sitting whereby much of the wool in South Africa is going to China. South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand are some of the biggest exporters of wool to China. And the black smallholder farmers in South Africa, they account for a greater share of that. And not only that, we've seen the income in the communities where this was done, as well as how much those households were happen to see the improvement in the income, spending for their children education, spending on improving their houses and all of that. It fundamentally changes some of the things. So there are those test cases, but that involves the private sector, that involves those communities having to have organizing power, which is where then I think the previous point we talked about of ensuring that we not only talk about empowering people on physical infrastructure, but also on soft infrastructure, then being able to organize yourself and then going out there to look for any organizations that can partner on what you have. And then there's a sharing of gains. There's also another area in South Africa of Willowvale, and people can look this up, a project called Whip Hold. Whip Hold started being these black women in South Africa, in the southern region, in a coastal area of the Eastern Cape again, where they came together and they approached the financial institutions to put the grain elevators, the silos, and then they merged their plots of land and decided that all of them will plant grain on that. And they brought on the agribusinesses that started tilling all of that land, introducing the better seed cultivars, and that they became the workers in this project, while at the same time they are sure at the end of the financial year they get to have certain dividends, but in the meantime they also benefit in terms of wages throughout month by month in operating that land. And that has change even the way that community is, because now it is known as a community that has infrastructure, a community that is operating at a commercial level, and certain areas of land that are reserved for agricultural activity. And everyone knows the generation that comes after those women begins then to focus more on other things and going to schools and doing, and it's been running for over a decade. So there are those test cases. What is always though difficult is to say, okay, if then we have all of those successful things, why aren't we replicating them out to other regions and in other countries? And then it comes back again to the political consideration, not only of politicians, but also of the communities at which some of these things could be done.
So one of the, and give me time to build out this question. In Nigeria, one of the challenges we have with food security is that we have terrorism, banditry, and those types of issues affecting farmers, so they're unable to go to the farms. One of the bigger challenges we have is the conflict between headers, cattle headers, and farmers, because we have this migratory, open grazing approach in raising cattle in Nigeria. South Africa produces a lot of beef. Most of it seems to be on ranches. What's been your experience in South Africa or in the southern regions of Africa, where you moved from the migratory transhumans cattle raising practices to more intensive ranching? And how has the economics of that played out, etc.? And here I'm seeking, probably solutions to the farmer header conflicts we have in Nigeria, not just in Nigeria, but even in places across the Sahel and all the way to Kenya and beyond.
I think there, but what we see being useful is really the inviting the large scale people that can invest in feedlots. And once they have those feedlots, and then they have whatever requirement of cattle that they have to process over time, introducing the economic aspect of that. And then people have to make sure that when their cattle are of certain age, they are able to sell them, and all of that. Because what we have seen in South Africa, even in the production of that beef, you do have about 34% of cattle that are still sitting in the informal land on those grazers that are somewhat similar to that, although confined only in certain areas. But there is also a limitation on how farmers in general can move their cattle, because we sit in a region which struggles with what we call foot and mouth disease. So all of these animal diseases, which have forced then even the government to say you cannot move your cattle to certain zones, so that we remain with the certain protocols on the animal health. But I think what assists then is making sure that the farmers have the area in which they can auction their cattle, because they keep them as that, because there's also some shortages on the cattle auctioning side and of keeping the livestock market pretty much liquid. And I think countries like Zambia and the others are actually also on that path of making sure that they are doing that. Zambeef and the others are some of the organizations that are participating strongly in the beef space. Namibia is also participating quite strongly in the beef market. So there are all of those aspects. But for me, it's really formalizing it and making sure that you invite the feedlots, so that they are there and the farmers, they have an avenue at which they can sell their livestock, because they migrate it, because sometimes your herd is so large to the extent that you're looking and driving and moving around looking for grazing path. But if you know that you can control your herd to a certain volume, and you have an area at which you are winning some off and you're selling some off, and all of that process needs to be introduced. And that comes with both education as well as an investment that will be needed on doing that.
And in our discussion, in the lead up to this conversation here. You had mentioned, some of the models that South Africa has for social protection, where people who are out of job, get paid some monies, etc., as a way of, cushioning the economic challenges that they may be facing. Could you just dwell a little bit more on how this works? And here I'm thinking more, what are some of the checks and balances that have been put in place to prevent abuse of this system, especially in countries where data might not be, one of our strongest suits. How do we prevent abuse of some of these social protection programs, which I think are important, even just as a palliative or as an interim solution, as we think of the longer term build out of the rural communities.
I mean, I think the first thing that, of course, every country has to always do is to think about your tax system. Because governments do not make money, they have to get it from somewhere. And I think everyone needs to get used to paying tax. I know rules differ country by country, but I think that's always the starting point so that they are in better fiscal space to do that. And then from there onwards, of course, then what ends up happening, people, and this in South Africa was new because what the protection support that we have had has always been for the elderly, from 60 upwards, and also for the young, people who can't work, who are between age of 18 to zero, and then they have the parents that are not working, and then they can apply for all of these production stuff, and it differs how much you get. You may find that for the elderly is 2,000 rand, and then for those that are somewhere young before between 0 and 6, it's 350. The others is 1,000 rand. It all differ as to how all of this is. But during the COVID time, there was an introduction of a 350 rand support system because many people were out of work, even in an informal sector, because of the limited activity that was introduced by COVID. And at the time also there was a fiscal space to do that. But because it's not coming without a cost in South Africa right now, it does present some fiscal difficulties, which is why South Africa had to explore possibilities of increasing the VAT, which is why I was starting point of saying money must be gotten somewhere. Tax is important because now you are thinking about how do you reallocate these resources. And this is important because then it keeps people at least having something that comes in. But I think the ultimate goal is always of saying we need to do something to create work and make sure that we address the unemployment. And I think the conversation that we started off with on the agricultural sector seeks to do that. Because in South Africa, we always say, even if you think about land reform and all of these things that we do, it's always have to have two objectives: restorative justice and economic growth, because it is economic growth that will actually deliver some of these things. It is economic growth that will make governments have money to spend on infrastructure. It is economic growth that makes governments to have money to do all of these social things, spends in school and. So that is always have to be the starting point for all of us.
Exactly, exactly. I have a question from Geraldine Eze Akili. Um, Says, as a practitioner in Northeast Nigeria, which is embattled with different degrees of conflict, where subnational governments, for instance, are heavily dependent on the federal government, with little interest in local economic development and practically little hope for infrastructure development, what other actor or actors can contribute to sustainable local agricultural development? Specifically, what are the roles of private sector in all of this? And I think really the question she's asking is, have you seen some collaborative approaches between government, private sector, maybe even civil society organizations, and successful models that have yielded, economic development, infrastructure development in South Africa or in the broader Africa region, especially as it relates to rural Africa?
I mean, I would say, Pat, of course, I mean, I sympathize with that because we face a somewhat different environment. That is a very difficult one because then when you begin talking about the conflict and all of that, even the private sector people will be a bit more reluctant because they are looking for the returns and the risk matrices begin to be quite different from there, which is why I think those are areas at which the NGOs and the others could play part in assisting to easing up some of that strain. But unfortunately, then the NGO world is the one that is strained now as there are conflicts everywhere. But where the private sector has helped in South Africa in a very different environment, it's when we had challenges. They're coming on and working with the national power utility in South Africa, Eskom, on saying what can they do in investing in the renewable. And that was a success because at least now we're sitting pretty much stable on the energy supply side. In the ports, we had periods where we had congestion in some of the, and they had efficiency issues. And the government, through its state-owned entities, Transnet, which manages our ports, with the private sector collaboratively working together to addressing some of those things. And that involves core investing in buying whatever equipment that is needed, and the government sometimes just easing on the regulations that are hindering investments, and then for the private sector to be able to participate on that. So there are all of those metrics, but I understand that this may not be as effective in a context at which you are asking on this, because then there is a context specific that is necessary, and unfortunately, the situation that you have explained is quite difficult. Yeah.
As we begin to, wrap up, let me even go back to a more fundamental question. So I've read your books, I've read some of your columns. You're quite bullish about Africa. Um, if we suspend for a minute, forget that you're South African, forget that you're African. What is really the source of your hope, of your bullishness about this continent that appears to everyone to have the ability to lead, but just hasn't been able to start? What's driving this hope? What's making you bullish? Look at it not as an African. Remove yourself and talk to me as to where you find a hope that Africa is not going to be left behind, especially as we jump deeper into this fourth industrial revolution. We don't have the skills to play. Why do you think we're not going to be left behind? And why do you think we're going to catch up and close the gap and probably sit at the table with our fellow humans?
I mean, I think for me, when I look at the continent and where optimism also really comes from, it comes from the young people of the continent. I mean, look at what's going on in Madagascar at the moment. They are overcome a couple of their challenges, and you have young people saying we want something different to do. There was in Nigeria, you had young people in various occasions in the previous years going to the streets, forgetting doing if it's so wrong, what political cycle we are living in. But the point is that they had different idea at which they are imagining for themselves. You think back about a year ago in Kenya, you had young people going out and saying they want something that for themselves. About 5 years, 6 years ago in Zimbabwe, you had young people going up saying they want something for themselves. Because ultimately, what we have now is a world that is shaped from a prism of the generation that was coming, and their vision and their view part by the transition from the previous regimes and coming on the democratic era. And now you have young people that have a similar exposure because of the technology to young people sitting in any country in the world. And I think for me, that's the source of optimism. But there is one thing, though, that I would say. I would say the young people of Africa needs to pretty much be involved on the political matters as they were. The idea that politics are not for you, you are educated, you will sit somewhere and do your own little things. Destruction and progress comes from politics of any other country. So we need to be active citizens regardless of where we are sitting. The optimism comes from the fact that we are all exposed to the same knowledge and same aspirations, but then we need to be active at every corner of the continent at which we are in trying to redefine and think about where we will be going. I mean, the young people in Sudan now, if you read the news and you look at the pictures and what's going on, they are out there asserting whatever political aspirations, for if you agree or you disagree with what they are saying, but they are saying something. And I think for me, that's where things will go right on. The only problem that we may have is if others are too important to be involved in politics, they will sit somewhere, because then that issue of wanting to be a passive citizen is what will plunge us to the very same problems that we have been in. But one can't help but to be optimistic about where the continent will pretty much lead. And of course, then thinking about the resource bases that the continent also have to offer the.
Interesting. Now, again, just let me go fishing again for ideas. I don't know if in your engagements in South Africa or across the continent, you found non-conventional or homegrown solutions to some of the challenges we face with re-energizing rural communities. And here I'm thinking maybe financing models. Are there some non-conventional financing models that you're seeing? Data is always a big problem with planning, with access to pricing information, access to market. Maybe new ways of financing agricultural inputs. We've got some ideas in Nigeria around, like Hello Tractor, where you can call up a tractor and use it for the number of hours without having to own that asset. Again, just looking for ideas that we could, ventilate here and could then trigger opportunities for, people listening from different countries.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I'm thinking now the cooler aspect that I talked about, the M-Pesa things that I mentioned. Those are some of those that ensure that at least in the early warnings environmentally, in a pricing signal for farmers, they offer that. But I think on the financing, we could still do a bit more. And I think a couple of people are trying up a whole range of instruments about what to do on that. And I think the financial institutions themselves, there is a role that they are beginning to play, whereby you see, I mean, again, outside Standard Bank with its own or farm share, one farm share app that they actually have, which actually has room across the continent. So those are some of the things that I think they are beginning to come up, which they may assist. And again, I would say these needs to be seen as the services that may come in. Fundamental discussed about land governance, infrastructure, still need to be arranged, because these enhance the farmers' capabilities in an environment that already has other things to function. Because it's one thing to know that if I'm sitting in Harare, if I'm sitting in Bulawayo, I can sell my product in Harare, Zimbabwe at an X price. But it's another thing then of getting it in there at a right quality in a most efficient time with lower transaction costs, which then requires again the infrastructure aspect. So I would say for me, these are all of the things that would enhance the information, but a couple of exciting things that are happening. And I would say also the journalists and the writers and thinkers in Africa, it's probably the responsibility whenever one sees something that is happening in their corner, even if you are in Malawi, you are in Djibouti, you have the capability of showcasing this, which is where then the
Exactly.
social networks at which we are in, perhaps they should be used in a much more collaborative way, so that each person showcases what are some of the things that are happening in their own corners, so that we can all learn and engage and interact on these things.
And maybe my second to the last question, if you were stuck in an elevator with the president of South Africa or with a group of African presidents, what is that one thing, that one message you want to get
Oof.
across to them as something that we cannot negotiate, something that they must do to energize rural Africa, to just get that sector moving again? What is that one thing you want to communicate to them or to him?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if I'm in a space with the leaders of the continent, the one thing that I would forward to them, framing again of agriculture, to say this is an economic sector, not the social only aspect. So that reframing is necessary, and that must be governance. And this is not going to cost them on a fiscal aspect, but they should begin putting the word out there of saying we are improving the land governance. Agriculture is a strategic economic sector, and send that message to the local authorities to get that done, and close it on by saying we will embrace science and urge our own regulators to look at whatever innovation that is being brought to us within a much more lenient prism in terms of risk, and think more about what we could achieve going forward. And I think those are some of the things that I could put forward with regards to this sector. And I think if they can do just that and sending that signal, and then allow the environment to sift out how to carry this forward, we could get far from the position that we are in.
Fantastic. And Wandile, we spent a lot of time and had a broad-based conversation, but maybe there's some point you wanted to make that I didn't get to. Maybe I can give you a few minutes to address that point.
I mean, the key thing I would still say is that, in all of the areas that we are sitting in the continent, the very same point that I raised for presidents is something that we need to put out. And I would say we need to reshape the narrative and how we write about Africa's agriculture. The idea that we go at every conference and we make these examples of our grandmothers and grandfathers farming somewhere, we think that they are relatable, which they are. But I think we need to change the narrative and actually sell what we want to see, not what you are observing from your village, because you are
Exactly.
trying to get somewhere. And I think changing that story in much of what we are writing and begin to start new energizing narratives about rural development in Africa that may lead us somewhere. I'm even fighting with newspaper publishers, Pet, whenever I'm submitting an article and they start to put an unappealing picture about how they depict Africa, I always pick an issue with them to say, this is not where we are going. We'll pick something much
Exactly.
more uplifting so that young people can see where we are going.
Exactly, exactly. I can't agree more with you. Wandile, thank you so much for the time you've spent with us, sharing on these many topics. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today's episode of Development Discourse. Big ideas, important questions, real conversations. And until next time, I'm Patrick Okigbo. Let's keep building that society we want to live in. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Wandile.